Welcome to Monday Morning Methane, where we like to say it's always Monday morning somewhere. That's not technically accurate. But today, at any rate, we are very lucky to have Amy Miller, CEO of Pragma, joining us on Monday Morning Methane. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, really excited to chat about some of the cool work you've been doing and your exposure to methane emissions. You were actually CEO at Energy Council for roughly 10 years. But recently, I'm seeing kind of things pop up on LinkedIn around like net big parties at Nasdaq and this thing called Pragma Energy. So could you maybe give us a little bit of an update on what you've been working on, what this new venture is, and why it's so exciting?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you've seen the social media presence. Yeah, Pragma, we created Pragma in September of last year, so we're just coming up to our 1 year anniversary, which is exciting. It's gone incredibly quickly. And when we set Pragma up, the purpose that we had in mind was we really wanted to support oil and gas companies to thrive. That was kind of our mandate. And our belief was that in order to do that, oil and gas companies needed access to a couple of different things. The first was access to capital. There's less capital availability. There's less investors, sometimes that we see interested in the space. And so, how could we play a role in introducing the right capital to the right projects? Um, we wanted to have an impact on helping oil and gas companies access technologies. It's a broad topic, I appreciate, but for us, it's anything that can improve effectiveness, efficiency, social license to operate, competitive advantage. Um, the third is around talent. How do we make sure that companies have the best and brightest C-level management teams, board level in particular, to kind of run the business in the best possible way? And finally, how do we support oil and gas companies in having the best positioning and the best messaging, whether it be for the public, whether it be for investors, whether it be for other stakeholders and shareholders, and all four of what we call kind of those pillars. So advocacy, capital, technology, talent, they're all linked, right? They all contribute and impact one another. And we wanted to kind of sit in the middle, as what we like to call kind of the energy industry's global matchmakers, to bring these pillars together and bring these people together to really help accelerate growth for individual companies and also advocate and educate to a wider audience about the importance of oil and gas. It's not going anywhere. And so how can we make sure that, it's approached in the most sustainable way?
I like that the matchmaking pillars. It's
Yeah,
it's a fun way to
yeah.
think about it. So obviously you cover a lot of ground from strategy to talent to technology. We work in emissions, and that's what this show is about. And that's one small piece of the puzzle for these oil and gas companies who are trying to navigate the energy future and thrive amidst a lot of transition that's happening globally. But you recently conducted a survey, I'm told, on how operators are potentially approaching emissions management, what some of the struggles are that they're having. What are some of the key challenges that stood out to you as you were talking to these operators?
Yeah, we did, and I think something that we realized in speaking to these operators, and we spoke to kind of 25 to 30 North American operators, and at that kind of management team level, there's so much pressure, for them coming from every different direction, trying to find a balance between cost savings without impacting safety, operational efficiency, new technology adoption, the complexities of that environmental piece, investor pressure. There's pressure coming from a lot of different directions. But on emissions management in particular, I think there were three challenges that really stood out. The first was data, the consistency and quality of the data that they're collecting, the sheer volume of data, that comes into their systems. For those companies that are looking at acquisitions, integrating emissions data from one company into the other, that poses a challenge. linking data across the business, so the impact of emissions data on other operational data and vice versa. A lot of partners, midstream partners, and kind of further down the value chain, are increasingly asking for upstream data, whether that's around OGMP compliance or carbon intensity per molecule or other areas. So I think that that data piece and kind of navigating the sheer volume and quality of data is tough. Um, the second I would say is probably not a surprise to you is around regulation. Um, there are so many different regulations and kind of navigating, the voluntary regulations like OGMP or MIQ, the mandatory regulations like the EPA regs. Obviously, there's new EU regulations around methane. And so in particular for LNG exporters, they're then also looking at how those EU regs are going to affect them and also how it might impact Asian regulations moving forwards, and trying to kind of put that in place. Is it going to mirror the EU or not? Um, there's so many different measurement systems. It's hard to find sometimes kind of meaningful comparisons between your peers when everyone's measuring in different ways. The TCFD, people still kind of say there's a bit of kind of vagary to that, especially around scope three expectations. The SEC climate disclosure rule didn't pass. And so I think there's this idea of kind of, oh my goodness, where do we start and how do we navigate these? And then finally, I think technology readiness. Um, there's so much technology to choose between, when it comes to emissions management. And we saw a real scale between operators that had, the most insane, complex and comprehensive tech stack to those who were kind of just starting out and had maybe one or two things around, handheld devices or sensors or, flyovers, etc. There's potentially huge cost involved in deciding what to pick, and then there's a lack of trust around we have to we're trying to save cost and we're trying to spend at the same time, and so how do we get that balance right, and how do we make sure that we're picking the right thing? What tech do we really need, and what's going to make the biggest impact, and then what's going to help us drive real insight from the tech that we pick when it comes to emissions measurement. So yeah, I think those were some of the three that came up.
Yeah, we're still in the messy middle of learning, and you'd almost think that, maybe there's a relationship between all this data that we have and the data products that are developing and kind of the plethora of expectations and regulations and voluntary initiatives that have emerged. They're all asking for different kinds of data products using different technologies. So it's definitely a bit of a mess. Let's zoom out a little bit. Um, we've seen kind of an evolution in how companies perceive sustainability over the past few years, from, you could call it kind of foaming at the mouth ESG fervor a few years ago, to kind of a more balanced and practical perspective these days. How are you seeing kind of this drive from a more of a compliance mindset, and this perspective, this kind of previous perspective on ESG, especially when it comes to emissions management, and how, potentially companies are thinking more practically about emissions management as a business strategy or as a cost saver?
Yeah, I 100% agree that it's not just about compliance, but really taking the time to understand how you want to position yourself as a business when it comes to sustainability. We're seeing people be a little bit more proactive, I guess, rather than reactive. And I think the key thing was signability isn't really seen anymore as something that sits on the business, but rather something that's integrated into and across the business. It's not just kind of a side bar. And I think there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, I think there was a large number of methane regulations and initiatives that came into play under the Biden administration, which maybe created more of a reactive response for operators trying to keep up with the latest changes. Um, with the current administration in place, I think for most operators, what we did understand from them is that they're not planning to make any, significant changes to the way that they do business or how they approach emissions management. But they do now have some time to breathe and implement changes in their business more proactively and in a way that makes sense for them, because every business is different. I think the second reason is yes, I think everyone agrees now that it's the right thing to do. Um, but it's also the right thing. It's the right thing to do from an environmental perspective, but it's also the right thing to do from an economic perspective. The more you keep in the pipe, the better for business. And so where there is this focus on kind of cost effectiveness, it's a cost saver to the business, and it's an economic necessity rather than just kind of a tick box exercise. And so people are looking at doing it in a more proactive way. And then the third and final one for me, I think, is there is such a focus at the moment on optimization and efficiency, and emissions management has a role to play there. Um, a few of the operators we talked to talked about this idea of kind of the multi-benefit project. So improving efficiencies and reducing emissions,
Uh-huh.
not just looking at something as just emissions and kind of a stick, I guess, but there's a carrot to it as well. It's about better data, better process flow, better uplift, improved production. You want to have all of that and reduce emissions, and the two things are they work together and are interchangeable.
Uh-huh. Yeah, one of I think your first data pillar is access to capital, and that's also a business case, presumably for emissions management. And I think we've seen investors and financial institutions evolve over the past few years in their thinking around, how would we like to hold oil and gas companies accountable? What kinds of data are we looking for? How are you seeing kind of those conversations evolve and those expectations evolve between investors and company leadership?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a few people in the report mentioned maybe that are focused on ESG or on emissions management more specifically, are taking a bit of a backseat amongst investors. But I actually think that the reality for that is that for the majority of operators are now actually pretty on top of their sustainability goals. And so investors aren't having the same conversations around theory, they're having conversations around execution. And execution takes longer. You can talk about the theory and your goals in as much detail as you want, but actually it takes time to then, to execute those things. And so where an investor might be only speaking about these things once a quarter rather than once a month, it's because there is an acknowledgement that that execution takes time. I think for investors, it's always the case that they want to see consistency. And so for them, it's not just about kind of setting goals and then forgetting about them. It's setting goals and hitting them. It's not about kind of empty promises. And they want to see that consistency, to my point earlier around sustainability being integrated across the business, not just a sideshow. They want to see how it links into that operational efficiency, that cost cutting, and methane abatement is a huge part of that. Um, and the final thing I'll say is, even if investors are more focused on financial performance and capital discipline than directly ESG, emissions management, as to my point earlier, forms a huge part of the way that you can hit financial targets. And so it is indirectly linked. And so I think where maybe ESG has become less of a buzzword, it's not a bad thing. It's just become something that has just become a normal part of the conversation.
So it sounds like investors believe that the energy companies that will continue to thrive kind of into the future are the ones who are going to be quite proactive and getting on top of their emissions management.
100%.
Yeah. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to see Pragma grow and evolve and witness the impact that you have. So, Godspeed, and thank you so much for joining Monday Morning Methane.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Thomas. Thank you.